Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Washington Examiner's Dialogue Series. I'm Philip Klein, and today we're in the offices of Utah Senator Mike Lee. We're going to be discussing Senator Lee's push for conservatives to adopt a positive reform agenda. Thank you for joining me today, Senator Lee.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So I just wanted to start off by saying it's been a common attack on the Tea Party movement over the past several years. That the Tea Party, they're just interested in breaking things and opposing Obama, and they don't have a lot of ideas. And one of the big attacks on that was last year's effort to defund Obamacare. But you were a big leader in that effort, an early leader, but you've also been pushing aggressively for conservatives to get behind a governing agenda, a positive agenda. So how do you see the relationship between those two? How do you respond to that critique? Is one response to the other?
Well, it's necessary for us to oppose the things that we're against in government, but being opposed to things that we're against in government isn't enough. We also need to identify what it is that we're for and push aggressively for that. As I've sometimes said in the past, had the Patriots that boarded the ship in Boston Harbor in 1773 simply stopped at protesting against what they didn't like out of their national government, what we now call the Boston Tea Party, would have been at most a footnote in history. But they moved on. They started identifying what it is that they wanted. And in the years that followed, they declared and they fought for and they won their independence. And eventually, by 1787, they had identified what it is that they wanted out of their government, what kind of government they wanted. And we've got to find ourselves on that same path from Boston to Philadelphia, where we go from merely protesting against what we don't want to identifying, outlining, and embracing what we do want.
Now, if we could just discuss for a minute how you see this moment in the history of the Republican Party in comparison to a recent moment, which was the late 1990s. And there are some parallels between what's happened during the Obama administration, what happened during the Clinton administration, in the sense that Republicans ended up taking over after a response to a health care bill that was unpopular. And then there was this standoff between the president and Congress. It led to a shutdown. And eventually there was a backlash within the party against that sort of tactic, and that ended up manifesting itself in a lot of the sort of big government programs that we saw Republicans adopt. The Medicare prescription drug pill, No Child Left Behind, the Wall Street bailout, all those things were sort of this outgrowth, and then that ended up sort of being the impetus for the Tea Party during President Obama's administration. So I guess my question is, do you think that if the conservatives, the limited government conservatives, don't get behind a sort of positive, specific policy agenda, that there's a risk that in the sort of vacuum of ideas that there could be a reemergence of this sort of, whether you call it compassionate conservatism or big government republicanism?
Well, first of all, I think we always have to be identifying what it is that we want. We always have to be developing an agenda. And I see the point there. I want to push back a little bit on the premise that conservatism is anything but compassionate. I think that conservatism, properly understood, is all about compassion. We are conservative, in other words, not in spite of our compassion. We are conservative because we're compassionate. So you referred to you brought up the comparison to the late 90s. I'd actually like to bring up a related comparison going back to the late 70s. In 1976, conservatives across America found a conservative leader for the ages in Ronald Reagan. And they ran him for the White House. They ran him for the presidency, and they lost. And Republicans lost the White House that year, and conservatives within the party were blamed for our loss of the White House and our loss in various Senate and House races throughout the country. But conservatives didn't go away. They instead regrouped, and they developed an agenda. And 4 years later, they came back with that same conservative leader for the ages, Ronald Reagan, and they won. They won because they had an agenda, and that's what we need to do. It's got to be bold. It's got to be conservative. We've got to paint with bold conservative colors, no pastels. And so that's what I've been trying to do.
So what do you think are the pillars of a conservative agenda?
Well, we've got to focus on how the poor and the middle class benefit from conservative policies. and how upward economic mobility in America has been hurt by progressive policies in recent decades. How the war on poverty has actually hurt poor and middle-class Americans. As the federal government has expanded its reach, we've seen a larger share of America's wealth being concentrated in the hands of the few. And so it's got to focus on upward economic mobility and demonstrate how it is that when we restrict government, especially the federal government, to its proper sphere, everyone benefits, especially the poor and the middle class.
Okay, well, on that point, for liberals, it's pretty obvious what their idea is to address issues such as poverty or income inequality. It's about more generous government benefits, minimum wage, increasing taxes on higher income earners, and trying to use that money to shore up social safety net programs and so forth. What do you see as the sort of conservative response, or not necessarily response, but sort of conservative plan to try to address some of those issues?
Well, we have to address them one step at a time. I've got a tax reform plan that has as its aim making it easier on America's working moms and dads to earn a living and to provide for their families. It gets rid of the marriage tax penalty and a little-known unintended consequence of the existing tax code, which is the parent tax penalty. We effectively tax working parents twice today, once as they're paying their taxes and a second time as they incur substantial child rearing costs. My tax reform package would dramatically simplify the code, bring us down to 2 rates under which the overwhelming majority of Americans would pay under one rate of 15%. This would be good for the economy. This would result in more jobs being created, and it would help America's working moms and dads.
Okay, now on that point, I mean, you're pitching your tax plan as a sort of family-friendly tax plan. But if you look at the 2012 exit polls, they find that 40% of the electorate wasn't married, and Republicans have had a tougher time reaching out to people who aren't married or who don't have children. So the question is, do you risk sort of alienating people who don't have the traditional families if the tax plan is geared around what the benefits are to parents?
No, I don't think so, especially when we explain to people what is actually happening. The fact that the way our senior entitlement programs are set up, it disproportionately shifts a lot of the burden on maintaining and sustaining our senior entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, on working parents. And so this isn't there to give an advantage to parents, an advantage to married people. It's there to help partially offset an existing inequity that exists in our tax code.
Okay, now one of the other possible reforms that people talk about is on the payroll tax side, because one of the issues that a lot of plans to cut taxes come across is the fact that a lot of Americans don't have a positive income tax liability, and most of what they pay is through the payroll tax. So I know that your plan, partially in terms of giving tax credits that could go against people's payroll tax payments too, it addresses that in some sense. But did you consider, or would you consider, plans that are addressed at more aggressively attacking the payroll tax cut, which for most working Americans is going to be their largest exposure to the federal tax system?
Well, I have considered it. In fact, I incorporated it into my bill. That's exactly what we did. So yeah, I am open to that, and I have done that in my bill.
But I'm just saying in terms of phasing out or cutting actual payroll tax rates, as opposed to, in your bill, I believe there's a credit that can go against contributions.
Right. Refundable up to that level.
Yeah.
Yes. Look, I'm willing to have a look at anything. Just the same, I never agree to anything without seeing the specifics. But you're right to point out that the payroll tax is an often misunderstood or often unappreciated problem. People don't always connect the dots and realize how the payroll tax ends up coming off of the bottom line of hardworking Americans.
But isn't also an aspect of it that when conservatives have a certain deference to the payroll tax, aren't they conceding or buying into this idea of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds as sort of being these existing systems where people pay into it and then they get out of it, as opposed to the actual structure in which it's actually funding general revenue and so forth.
Well, you're talking about reading into the conservative psyche or to the mind of the individual conservative senator or representative, things that might not necessarily rise to that level. I mean, what we've got to stay focused on is starting with the government that we have rather than the government that might have been had we all along been more faithful to conservative principles. And the fact is that these things are part of our existing structure, and that's where we have to start.
I mean, on that point, do you think that that creates a problem for conservatives to try to make the case, in the sense that oftentimes Republicans, when they argue about public policy, have to argue within a certain framework that's been promoted by liberals, in the sense that Republicans often will come out and won't come out and explicitly say, we don't think that there's a constitutional role for the federal government to give everyone and guarantee everyone health coverage. It's very rare that you see elected Republicans say that. So
it's becoming less rare.
Yeah, but I guess the issue is that if Republicans aren't engaging at that sort of philosophical level, and oftentimes what comes out of Republicans is, oh, well, we're not denying that, we just want to do it without the burdensome regulations and taxes of Obamacare. Do you end up in a situation where Republicans end up essentially negotiating the terms of surrender to big government?
There certainly is the risk. I understand the dynamic that you're talking about. There is that risk that we'll end up negotiating with ourselves and always splitting the difference to the left, and that's where we've ended up in the problem that we've got. But that is not to say that we can't start to make things better. That is not to say that we surrender our principles every time we try to work within the existing framework.
Okay, now, partially related to that.
I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, back during the whole effort to defund Obamacare, one of the arguments that many supporters of the defund movement had made was that once January 1st comes and the benefits kick in, then it'll become entrenched like other government programs. Do you think that that's happened? I mean, obviously we can debate around whether the precise figure is 8 million or how many people were previously uninsured or who's paid and not. But if we can acknowledge that a certain number of people are benefiting through the Medicaid expansion and through the subsidies on the insurance exchange, does that change the sort of repeal and replace dynamic? Does it reshuffle the deck at all?
Of course it does. I mean, the status quo changed rather dramatically on January 1st. And that, coupled with the fact that the president refuses to this day to follow the law as it's written and has essentially modified it without going through Congress, unconstitutionally, that was the impetus for us saying, look, we do have the prerogative as members of Congress to fund government. And the way it's supposed to work is we're supposed to fund things by government function. We're not supposed to be operating in this framework where we just hit the reset button every year. And so what we were suggesting is let's have one bill to fund defense, another bill to fund our judicial system and criminal justice system and so on and so forth, so that Obamacare could be funded or not funded on its own merits and not on the merits of something else. Back to your question. We're past the January 1st start date, so yeah, we are necessarily, unavoidably, in a different position than we would have been had we been able to act meaningfully before January 1st. But that is not to say that we have crossed a point of no return. I mean, look, a lot of Americans are being harmed by Obamacare, and we have not yet begun to see the full scope, the depth and the breadth of harms caused by Obamacare, in part because a lot of it hasn't kicked in yet because the administration keeps acting quite unconstitutionally in order to delay some of the more harmful provisions.
Now, you spoke recently at the Heritage Foundation, and you talked about the importance for Republicans to take on crony capitalism and political privilege and this sort of intersection between big business and big government. Now, during that speech, you mentioned the Export-Import Bank as one of what you said was the most important and winnable fight for conservatives on that front this year. Can you just describe, first of all, to some people who might be watching this that aren't familiar with the Export-Import Bank, what it is and why it's so important, and then explain why you think it's a winnable issue this year?
Sure. So the Export-Import Bank is a government program that arranges for financing, provides financing for certain equipment manufactured in the United States and purchased by customers outside the United States. The overwhelming majority of all of Ex-Im's work actually goes toward products manufactured by companies that are more than capable of securing financing in the private market. And I just don't see any reason why the government should be engaged in this business.
So why do you think that it's winnable this year?
I think it's winnable because more people are starting to understand what it is. More people are coming to an understanding that the government shouldn't be involved in this business. And I think it's an issue that is neither Republican nor Democratic. It is simply American. That we don't need the government duplicating what the marketplace can already do. And when we do try to do that, it ends up favoring the preferred interests, the business interests out there that have the best connections in Washington. And that's not a good idea. That doesn't end well.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you be prepared to filibuster the renewal of the Ex-Im Bank if it passed through the House with Obama's terms?
Well, we'll see. As a practice, I don't generally signal far in advance what procedural tools that I might use in a particular battle.
And where do you think that the leadership of on the Senate side among Republicans is on this issue this year?
I don't know. But I will say that there are a growing number of Republicans who have concerns with Ex-Im. And as public awareness is on the increase, I think concerns with the Export-Import Bank are also on the increase.
Now, your experience, your background obviously is with constitutional law. And there are a subset of conservatives who have argued that the sort of a lot of the problems that we have are more fundamental than mere policy, in the sense that the relationship between the federal government and the states has just been gone so out of whack from what was originally intended that we need more fundamental changes, like an Article 5 convention to sort of have amendments that reestablish this balance. I know it's something Mark Levin has talked about, and Randy Barnett, the law professor. Where do you stand on something like that?
Both Mark Levin and Randy Barnett are friends of mine, and I love Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments. I have long had concerns with the idea of an Article 5 convention. You know, the last time we had a constitutional convention was in 1787. We have adopted 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. All 27 of them have been adopted through the other method, which is one in which Congress proposes by a vote of 2/3 in each chamber a constitutional amendment, and then that amendment takes effect after it's been ratified by 3/4 of the states. With the convention track, the way it would work is that 2/3 of the states call on Congress to convene a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments. Congress then convenes such a convention, and the convention proposes amendments. Those amendments become effective, if at all, after they've been ratified by 3/4 of the states. So there is some safety valve there, but you know, it worries me, and I've never quite been able to get over those concerns. But I will say people like Mark Levin and Randy Barnett have me thinking about this. They make some very valid points, which center around the fact that Congress has not acted, and Congress seems to have every incentive not to act to limit its own power. It still does not resolve my concerns entirely, but they've got me thinking.
Could you weigh in for a moment on switching gears? Obviously, foreign policy in recent months has taken on a bigger role in the debate. And there's been this big debate among Republicans about, while there's general consensus that Republicans believe in limited government at home, there's a big debate over what the role should be abroad. And where do you fall in this argument in terms of how involved America should be in world affairs?
You know, I think that we need to be focused on protecting the United States of America, and the further removed any decision goes, any foreign policy or military decision, the further removed from American national security that we get, the more we can run into some of those problems. Most members of Congress in both political parties on both ends of the Capitol would probably agree with a statement like that. The devil is in the details. Different people view different conflicts differently in terms of their capacity to affect U.S. national security, in terms of their capacity to present a threat to our own safety here at home. And so that's where the debates very often happen. But, you know, you saw something interesting a few months ago. The administration appeared quite poised at one point, quite ready to get the United States involved militarily in Syria. And there were quite a few in Congress who were more than eager and willing to support him in that. And the American people spoke loudly, and I spoke loudly against it, concluding that there was far too attenuated a link, a connection between what might have been our involvement in Syria and American national security. And there was not, I couldn't get a straight answer from those who were proposing this intervention on how our action there would make us any safer as opposed to less safe. And a lot of people felt the same way, and as a result, we stayed out.
Okay, and one other thing. Right now, we're obviously in a midterm election year. If Republicans were to take over control of the Senate, how does that affect the position of conservatives in the Senate? It's typically going to be sort of the midterm elections are going to flow right into the presidential elections. What's the how does it really affect the goals of the conservatives in the Senate if leadership changes?
Well, I think it's a very significant change. It'll be a watershed year if we can make that happen. Shifting the leadership would, I think, first of all, open up the voting process. We have been locked out of amendments for the most part under the Democratic leadership in the Senate. Just getting the ability to have votes, as I'm confident we would have votes under Republican leadership, would make a big difference. We've got all of these bills that have been passed in the House, all these bills that take a conservative approach to helping to fix the economy that have not received votes. Regulatory reform bills, spending reform bills that have been held up and have not had adequate opportunity to be considered. In some cases, no opportunity to be debated or voted upon in the Senate, would all of a sudden have the chance to move forward. That alone would be huge, in addition to the fact that you would have affirmative legislation coming out of the Senate as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Senator Lee, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Dialogue. See you next time.